There Follows the Dark, Chapter 5. Even in the daytime, the elder wood was eerily dark. What light managed to work its way through the canopy was choked by the thickets of branches and dense, grim bark. It was a forest that seemed to drink in the light of the sun with something very much like contempt. It was as if the elder wood was telling the sun that it wasn't welcome here anymore, contenting itself to light its own bark and branches and strangled footpaths with luminous lichens and oddly glowing mushrooms. It was early evening when Jinx had finally let Lux out of bed. She had given her a once-over, which Lux had allowed with a certain amount of amusement. There was something almost charming about having Jinx fussing over her. Charming and familiar. Lux still couldn't put a finger on that sensation. Jinx? The older witch glanced over her shoulder. Something that was a bit harder now that her blocky wand, Pow Pow, was secured to her back. Lux wasn't certain how it was secured, actually, given that there were no straps or harness attaching it. As far as she could tell, Pow Pow was just floating there. "Where are we going?" Lux asked when Jinx didn't respond. "To get my other wand," she replied, nodding down the overgrown path that she was navigating with ease and that Lux kept tripping down. "Other wand?" Jinx nodded. "Yeah, Pow Pow won't admit it." She patted the wand on her back fondly. "But they get anxious when Fishbones isn't nearby." "Fishbones," Lux repeated slowly. She was really going to have to get used to Jinx's off-kilter naming scheme. Then again, Jinx claimed that she didn't name them at all, which suggests that the wands named themselves. Who knows? Maybe that was normal for witches. "Yeah, but that won't be too hard. I'm pretty sure I know where he is," Jinx said with a grin. Lux cocked her head. "If you know where where he is, then why didn't you go get him?" Jinx shot Lux another confused look over her shoulder. "Because I would have had to leave you alone, Blondie. Duh." That should have been obvious. It shouldn't have surprised Lux, knowing how far Jinx had gone for her. She still wasn't sure how to parse that other than to take it as some kind of proof that Jinx cared about her. The question Lux had to ask herself was why? Why did Jinx care so much? And more importantly, why did Lux not care? It wouldn't do her any good to pretend that she wasn't unusually comfortable around Jinx, despite knowing her for all of about 5 conscious hours. It wasn't even about what she'd sacrificed to keep Lux safe, either. Lux had felt comfortable with Jinx the moment she had laid eyes on her, and she had no logical or even semi-plausible explanation for that feeling. And yet, it was still there. Just looking at her now, with those odd blackthorn tails of hers swinging back and forth behind her like braids, Lux could feel a sensation ignite in her breast from embers she'd thought extinguished the day her own people came for her. The day her family was ripped away from her and she was sent stumbling into the dark in search for solace. It was trust. For no feasible reason Lux could count, she was absolutely sure that she could trust Jinx. She had to actually remind herself to try to be suspicious around Jinx, but she kept failing. Worse, anytime she sought an answer for why that was, her mind kept giving her the same nonsensical reply. Because it's Jinx. "You alright, Blondie?" Lux looked up, jarred out of her mental wanderings, to find Jinx stopped in the middle of the path with an odd look on her face. "I'm fine. Why?" Lux replied, but her teeth chattered painfully around the words as she spoke them. It took her a moment to realize that she wasn't fine. She was absolutely freezing. "You sure about that?" Jinx asked as she turned with an arched eyebrow. Her too wide grin was cocked and slanted under black-pinned eyes that were trying to hold back a laugh. "'Cause, you don't look fine." "Okay, maybe I'm not fine," Jinx stammered as she wrapped her arms around herself. She'd borrowed clothes from Jinx, and despite their radically different frames, Lux had been surprised to find that they all fit her perfectly, and were far more comfortable than the rags Jinx had presumably had to peel her out of. She had a thick knit tunic and comfortable hide trousers held up with a belt of good stout leather, the same material that made up her new fur-lined vest, which inexplicably fit better than the last vest that her own mother had bought for her. Jinx had lent her a cloak, too, and a pair of solid traveling boots. Those fit her, too, strangely enough. And when Lux had asked about the fitting, Jinx had just smirked and said, "Magic." Despite all that, she was still freezing. Lux rubbed at her arms, trying to force some warmth back into them, and as she looked around, she found hints of snow and frost on the ground, and hoary rime clinging to the tree branches and bark. "Where are we?" Lux hissed through a clenched jaw. "And why aren't you cold?" And Lux looked around in disbelief. "Where did all this snowfall come from? We're still in the heart of autumn." "It's always like this here," Jinx said, gesturing around them. "This is the Ibex's running grounds." She jerked a thumb further down the path. "And Fishbone's like splashing around in the lake in the middle of her territory." "Can you make me not cold too, please?" Lux bit out. Jinx frowned. "Why don't you do it?" "Do I look like I know how to do it?" Lux snapped, and Jinx jolted back as if stung. On instinct, Lux reached out a hand and grabbed at Jinx's, holding on tight and pulling her back. "Wait, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to shout," she said shakily. I'm cold, and I really hate the cold, okay? I'm sorry." Jinx stared for a moment with wide, black-pinned eyes, looking for all the world like a startled beast. Then, slowly, she relaxed, then nodded faintly with a bitter little laugh. "Right. Yeah, you do. I forgot," Jinx said quietly. "Forgot?" Lux started, but before she could pursue the question further, Jinx shook her head and squared her shoulders at Lux. "Okay, here, just do this, alright, Blondie?" Jinx took her hands and turned them palms up, then pressed her thumbs to the center of Lux's palms hard enough to force her fingers to start curling inwards. "Feel that? When I push, right? You feel it?" Yes, Jinx, I can feel you digging your thumbs into my hands," Lux replied weakly. Well, with Jinx touching her so much, at least she was starting to warm up. Jinx, seemingly oblivious, kept nodding. "Good. Now, try to hold on to that pressure, okay? Hold on to it hard. Remember how it feels. That kind of burn on the surface of your skin, the scratch, the sharp little..." She pushed her thumbnails in just slightly to Lux's palms, causing her to wince. "Ache. Alright? Hold on to it and push back when I say so. Got it?" "Yeah," Lux nodded. The whole time, all Lux could do was stare into those intensely bright blue eyes that were made all the brighter by the darkness around them. Her eyes lingered on those thin, chapped lips and the shadows beneath her eyes, on that strangely dignified nose that might have been arrow straight before being broken 3 too many times. She had so many scars, many of them well worn or well hidden, but staring at her like this, with her face so close, they were impossible to miss. Underneath it all, though, there was a softness to Jinx that had been made lean and sharp by too many hard years. "Don't look away," Jinx whispered. "I won't." "Now!" It was a twinge, and Lux clenched her jaw as she tried to hold on to that feeling of pressure in her hands. An instinctive part of her wanted to immediately look down to see if she was doing it right, but Jinx's words rang in her head. "Don't look away." So she didn't. She stared into Jinx's black-pinned blue eyes and focused, holding on to that ache and burn and pressure. Light spilled up from her hands in a ravenous torrent, banishing the shadows from around them and illuminating Jinx's face in stark, venomous energy. It poured around them, hot and hungry, and Lux almost yelped in panic at the sudden upswell of power. Jinx didn't let her. The older witch seized onto Lux's wrists, keeping her from jerking back, and her grin widened to the point that her chapped lips seemed to crack. "You're safe, Blondie." Jinx spoke the comforting words that her expression ought to have ruined. That wide, madcap smile should have felt anything but safe. I know," Lux stammered. Jinx nodded slowly, then licked her lips. "Okay, now breathe it in. The light, right? It's hungry. It bites the cold and the dark, and it eats them all up, so breathe it in, but don't close your eyes." Lux nodded frantically. She'd never summoned this much of her light before. In fact, she'd barely used it at all for fear of outing herself in the wrong place. A big part of her resented her light. That same part hated it for being the reason her family was taken away. But seeing it here and now, like this, with Jinx by her side, she found she couldn't hate it the same way. So Lux breathed in her light. Slowly, she curled her fingers closed, and at the same time she drew in a deep breath. The air around them was warmer than it had been a moment ago. Jinx was right. Her light was warming the air. Lux closed her fingers as she swallowed the light back up into herself and drew it into her lungs. Warmth bloomed inward from her fingertips and palms, and outward at the same time from her core, until she was flush with it, until her shivering stopped completely. And through it all, she never looked away from Jinx. "Better?" Jinx asked. "Better," Lux said softly. Before Jinx could draw her hands back, Lux caught her by the wrists, and Jinx furrowed her brow. Lux held on tight as she still refused to look away. Those eyes. What was it about those eyes? Dark and deep and old. Older than they ought to be, right? Lux wasn't sure that witches aged the same way normal people did, but Morgana had said that Jinx was young, too. A young witch like her. "Who are you?" Lux asked. "Really, I mean, who are you? And why?" Lux released Jinx's wrist and laid a palm on her cheek. "Why do I know your face?" For a long moment, Jinx was silent. Her rictus grin had turned glassy and fragile as she raised her hand to lay it over Lux's, as she leaned her cheek into the gentle touch. Out of nowhere, a wave of grief struck Lux's heart like a hammer blow, and suddenly she couldn't find her breath. Her lungs hitched and burned as she tried to drag in air, and her eyes burned too. "Don't cry, Blondie," Jinx said quietly as she freed her other hand from Lux's grip and brought it up to the blonde mage's cheek to wipe away the stream of tears. "It was just a bad dream." "A dream?" The withering snap of a bowstring split the air, and suddenly Jinx was tackling Lux to the ground. Lux landed on her back onto the hard, frozen ground, and the impact beat the air from her lungs as an arrow whickered over her head, right through the space where Lux had been standing. The arrow impacted a tree a handful of meters away, and in a flare of brackish light, the tree flash-froze. What life was left to it blackened to death as ice sapped everything from it, leaving only brittle, winter-starved wood behind that quickly cracked and splintered under its own weight, before falling ponderously backward with a deafening crash. Before Lux could catch her breath, Jinx was up. The limber witch straddled Lux, crouching over her protectively as she snapped an arm out. "Get him, Pow Pow!" The wand responded enthusiastically, detaching from Jinx's back with a sharp, if slightly drunken-looking swing, and Jinx seized the curved stone grip at the base. Those long, scarred fingers tightened hard around the grip, and Pow Pow's 3 floating stone blades, which had, a moment ago, been rotating in a lazy orbit around one another, suddenly began to spin violently. "Jinx, what—" Lux's question was drowned out by an unearthly, keening shriek as sharp darts of baleful blue light began spitting in a blinding stream from the tips of Jinx's wand. Pow Pow roared and screamed as its light hammered in a constant, flensing stream that Jinx directed downrange in the direction the arrow had come from. She panned left and right with a surprisingly steady aim, and Lux's eyes widened as she watched Jinx mow down the foliage. Tree trunks shattered and detonated with flashes of blue witch fire, and the hard earth was chewed to meal where the bolts ripped into them. In seconds, Jinx had defoliated a massive swath of forest in front of them, and only when the space was clear did she let up and raise her wand. Until now, Lux had known intellectually that Jinx was probably powerful. Seeing it firsthand, though, was a beast of an entirely different set of stripes. What troubled Lux most wasn't that Jinx was clearly dangerous. It wasn't even that Jinx was even more clearly insane. No, what troubled Lux was really only 2 things. One, that the aforementioned caveats didn't bother her even when she knew that they should, and 2, seeing Jinx like this, with her wide split grin and black pinned eyes lit by the fires of destruction all around her, didn't frighten Lux. Oh, her heart was beating faster, so fast in fact that Lux could swear it was about to hammer right out of her ribcage. But it wasn't fear. It wasn't fear at all. "You dare!" A voice like hard-bitten winter winds echoed around them as the wind picked up, and Jinx stood slowly, never taking her eyes off their surroundings as she held out one hand to Lux and kept the other gripping Pow Pow tightly. Lux accepted the proffered limb and levered herself up as the air turned colder and the wind picked up, roaring into a snapping flurry that turned into a whiteout of snow. Ah, shove it up your quiver, Ash. I was just giving the newbie a tour and picking up fish bones, okay? Jinx shouted into the blinding winds. After a moment, the torrent of snow began to calm. Then it faded, and when Lux's vision finally cleared, she found herself looking at a tall, powerfully built woman. She wore form-fitting black leather that was edged with gold and wore a cloak of purest white, tinted in places with shades of royal purple over her broad shoulders. Her face was half obscured by a shroud-like mantle, held in place over her head by a dark crown of upthrust spikes that looked like nothing so much as frozen spears of metal, and which ended at her brow in a stylized beak tipped with gold. And in her hand was the largest and most terrible-looking bow that Lux had ever seen in her life. Despite the shrouded hood covering her eyes, Lux felt the witch that Jinx had alternatively called Ash and the Ibex turn her gaze upon her, and she shivered under the cold regard. "You, girl, are our newest sister?" Ash asked in a flat tone. Yes," Lux replied cautiously as she gained her feet and turned to face the woman. She didn't let go of Jinx's hand, though. She wasn't sure she could at the moment. "Then know this. Do not bring the warmth of the dead sun into my domain without my consent." Ash gestured around them with her open hand. "Next time I will not be so forgiving." "Next time I will not be so forgiving," Jinx parroted back mockingly, and Lux turned to shoot a withering glare at the woman. "Come on, Ash, she's brand stinking new, okay? Cut her some slack. Maybe don't open with," she gestured back towards the fallen ice-blighted tree, "the old elderwood handshake." Ash turned to fix what Lux was certain was a glare on Jinx. "Perhaps you forget, little sister, that the only others who wield that magic are sworn to our utter extermination." "Yeah, and I'm what, giving him an escort?" Jinx countered, crossing her arms over her narrow chest as Pow Pow idly floated to her back. "You have ever been the least reliable of our sisters, Rook," Ash said grimly. Jinx began to open her mouth, but before she could get a word out in her own defense, Lux surprised herself by storming out between them as rage boiled up from the core of her chest and spat, "Jinx would never!" Her voice echoed through the snow-dappled forest as Ash took a step back, with shock writ clear in her open stance and the way her head snapped back. "How dare you!" Lux snarled as she stomped up to Ash and thrust a finger under the witch's nose, who stumbled back with a hiss of pain. "How dare you! Jinx would never work with those... Lux, stop." A hand settled on Lux's wrist, and Lux's eyes widened as she realized she was glowing. That sick, noisome light was spilling out of every pore in her body, out of every strand of hair, and even from her eyes. The air was heating around her, and the ground beneath her feet was blackening into scorched death. And Jinx's hand was starting to blister where it was touching her. With a gasp, Lux sucked the power back into herself the way Jinx had taught her. The light still left behind angry red welts and blisters across Jinx's palm, but the woman didn't seem to notice. Her rictus grin was still in place, and her eyes were on Lux as she closed her long, scarred fingers around Lux's wrist and forced her hand down. "Oh, Jinx, I'm sorry. I didn't mean... Your hand!" Lux reached out and took Jinx's hand, turning it over to find a mess of peeling skin, pale blisters, and angry red welts. "Oh, gods, Jinx!" she sobbed as she looked back up at Jinx's smiling face. I hurt you. I didn't mean to..." "Are you okay, Blondie?" Jinx asked. Am I okay?" Lux repeated dumbly. "Jinx, I'm fine, but your hand..." Jinx looked down at her hand and flexed her fingers a few times. They responded sluggishly at first, and in places wept blood. Lux could only stare in horror as Jinx tightened her fingers into a fist, gripped, and blood spilled between her knuckles. "Yeah, seems fine," Jinx said, looking back up at her. Lux choked back a sob. "Fine? Fine? Nothing about what just happened was fine. Jinx was hurt, and it was her fault. She'd hurt Jinx because she couldn't control her magic, just like..." "Rook, enough." Ash laid her hand over theirs, and Lux turned to snap at the witch. Her words died on her tongue. Ash's hood was down to reveal a pale-skinned witch with long platinum hair. Her eyes were the color of glacial ice, and they were much softer than Lux had expected. A soothing chill flowed down from Ash's hands, and Lux turned to see the welts and burns fade slightly. Shadows of the damage were still there, and nothing could be done about the split skin and blisters. But once the spell was done, Ash flicked her fingers and produced a length of pale cloth that she wrapped around Jinx's palm. "There," she said as she released Jinx. "My error has been mended, Rook." Jinx eyed the binding, then glanced up at Lux, who was looking nervously between Jinx's damaged hand and Ash, who she had just lately been screaming at. Thanks," Jinx said with a shrug. Ash gave a faint nod at the acceptance of her tacit apology before turning to Lux and making a slightly deeper bow. "And my apologies to you, little sister, for the grim welcome. I am Ash of the Jet Ibex, and I erred in my assessment. Forgive your elder sister for her overcautious ways. I've little love for the Lightbringers. And forgive her, too, for her harsh words to the Rook." It's all right," Lux said quietly as she held out a hand. "My name is Luxana, but please call me Lux. I'm not of anything anymore." "Not yet," Ash replied with a small smile as she took Lux's hand and shook it. "Once you receive your mark, that will change, and you will change with it." Lux started to ask about that, but before she could, Ash turned to Jinx. "And you, Rook. I was expecting you days ago to collect your wand." "Yeah, sorry about that," Jinx laughed as she scratched the back of her head awkwardly. "Lux needed to sleep off a few hundred rough nights." She nodded towards Lux. "So we waited." I suppose I can't argue with that," Ash grumbled as she looked back to Lux. "Were you pursued by the Witchfinders?" Lux nodded gravely, and Ash harumphed. "Apologies again, then, for mistaking you," Ash repeated. "You must be quick and clever, in addition to strong, to have survived so long." "I accept your apology, and if it's all the same to you, I'd rather not think about it too much," Lux said weakly. "Fair." Ash turned to Jinx, who was idly examining the binding on her hand. "Now would you please collect your wand? My lake has been in turmoil for over a week, and I'm growing weary of it." "Fine." Jinx reached down and seized Lux's hand. "Come on, Blondie, we got fish to catch." Lux yelped as she was towed along, but as she passed Ash, who fell in quickly behind them, she caught a glimpse of a strange expression on the cold woman's face. It wasn't suspicion. It was more like wonderment, as if she was trying to process something she was seeing and was failing. The strangest part was, it wasn't Lux she was looking at. It was Jinx.